The Windmill on the Marshes, written and read by Christopher Halton. It was on a September evening in 1936 that I found myself driving into a heavy bank of mist, which had rolled across the fields near the River Bure in Norfolk, a flat, relentless expanse of grazing marsh in the Norfolk Broads. Dusk was falling, and I was anxious to reach the safety of a friend's house in Horning. But the mist only thickened until it became apparent that I had lost my way. I soon found myself trundling along a rutted track that appeared to lead into nothingness. After several minutes and with a rising sense of panic, I discerned through the fog the familiar outline of a brick windmill tower, its mighty sails motionless yet outstretched, like arms spanning the darkness. Nearby stood a small lean-to cottage, a single light glowing faintly at its window. Drawing the car to a halt, I resolved to speak with the occupant in the hope of finding my bearings. As I approached, I observed that the tower was built into the remains of a far older structure, an ancient medieval gatehouse, its base partially enclosed by fallen masonry, though the mill itself stood clear of the rubble and hard by the trackway. I knocked at the cottage door, but there was no reply. Unwilling to intrude further upon what I assumed was the miller's home, I walked instead around the structure to what must once have been the gatehouse's ornate arched entrance, now opening directly into the body of the mill. Having travelled from Lincolnshire, I had never seen nor heard of so strange a place. Though the air felt heavy with uncertainty, and indeed with dread, it was curiously compelling as well. I returned to my car and retrieved a battery flashlight, which proved of little practical use beyond casting a weak fan-shaped beam into the mist. It seemed there was no one at home, either in the cottage or the mill, and I paused, uncertain what course to take. It was then that I heard, faintly at first, the tolling of a solitary bell. At last, I thought, there was life nearby. Perhaps a church bell sounded as a warning to river traffic of the danger along the banks in such conditions. Quite frankly, I was lost and perplexed. I set off across the cow pasture toward the sound, which grew steadily louder until, to my astonishment, a line of black-hooded monks emerged from the gloom and passed silently by me, disappearing almost at once into the opaque darkness. They appeared wholly absorbed in their own contemplation, and I assumed them to belong to a silent order that avoided contact with outsiders. At the very least, I reasoned, there must be someone among them who could assist me. As I drew closer to the now deafening clang of the bell, the air grew colder and more oppressive, filling me with a mortal dread I could not properly explain. Then, looming suddenly out of the mist, there appeared before me a vast and ornate tower, its heavy haunches rising at each corner and piercing the pall above. Beyond it, I could just make out the dim outline of something far grander and more substantial, and then I lost consciousness. "Are you feeling yourself again?" The voice came as I regained consciousness. I opened my eyes to find myself lying upon a brass bedstead inside a small lean-to cottage. As my vision steadied, I saw a round-faced man leaning over me, his expression one of mild concern. He was perhaps in his late 30s, with heavy rosy cheeks, pronounced mutton-chop side whiskers, and a small goatee beard. He wore a warm blouson-style shirt with a neckerchief at the collar. Taking my shoulders gently, he helped me into a sitting position. The cottage proved to be a single room, lit by oil lamps and crowded with solid Victorian furniture, dark and well worn by use. He seated himself on a three-legged stool and raised a glass of brown liquid to my lips. "Drink this," he said. Too confused to question him, I obeyed. The liquid was a good naval rum, of evident quality, and once I had swallowed a mouthful, I took the glass from him and drained it. "Where?" I began. He smiled faintly. "I found you lying out in the pasture. A fortunate thing, too. I was out gathering my cows. And the monks? I asked at once. Where are the monks? He gave a short laugh. Long dead and buried, I should think. Seeing my confusion, he went on to explain that he was a miller, and that the monks I had seen belonged to the order of St. Benedict, though they had not been sighted for some 400 years, ever since King Henry VIII had abolished the monasteries. Of the Abbey itself, he said, little now remained beyond the gatehouse and a fragment of wall. The rest had long since been taken away for building stone. In fact, he added, the mill was set inside the gatehouse on account of the marsh. It was the only firm footing to be had. I rose from the bed, becoming conscious then of his somewhat old-fashioned manner of dress. Yet I reflected that in the remoter parts of Norfolk, country folk had altered little over the years, and so thought no more of it. He told me his name was Thomas Minns, and that although he lived in Horning, he stayed at the cottage whenever work required his presence at the mill. The fog, he observed, was lifting, and he kindly gave me directions by which I might reach the village. When I asked where precisely I had wandered, he replied simply, "Oh, St. Benet's Abbey." I thanked him, took my leave at the cottage door, and returned to my car. Within minutes I was back on the road, and shortly afterwards arrived safely at my friend's house, by then fully dark. My friends Joe and Daphne Smithfield were both relieved and astonished to see me, having feared I might have come to some harm in the earlier mist. I was too weary to give a full account of my misadventure, and indeed was already beginning to wonder whether my encounter with the monks had been no more than a fancy, perhaps conjured by the strange surroundings and my own disorientation. I mentioned only that a local man by the Marshes had assisted me, and that on the following day I intended to return in daylight to offer my thanks. After a good night's sleep I felt rested, and after a hearty English breakfast we discussed the usual generalities of polite conversation, ranging from work to the weather to future plans. The Smithfields were my neighbours back in Lincolnshire, and had only recently arrived in Norfolk following Joe's new appointment with a chartered surveying firm. I described St. Benet's and the mill to them, and being not far from the river, we all agreed to make a day visit to the area and its rich history. After breakfast we set off in my car, a Ford Prefect saloon, and soon arrived at the location, which seemed slightly different from how I remembered it the previous night. We discovered that the track was gated and were directed to park in a small parking area. I gave it no further thought, assuming the miller had probably left the gate open to drive his cattle to a neighbouring field. In every other respect, however, everything appeared the same until we reached the mill tower in the gatehouse. Turning to my friends, I said, "This is odd. I cannot see the lean-to cottage from last night." Pointing to the side of the tower before us, I added, "I'm sure it was there." Joe, somewhat bemused, replied, "Well, old chap, you were in a pea super. Perhaps it's on the other side." Together all three of us wandered around the tower, but could find no trace of it. "Are you sure we are in the right place?" Daphne interjected. I smiled and said to them both, "Where else would you find a windmill inside a medieval gatehouse?" At that moment, a cold chill of realization washed over me, as I realized a significant detail I had overlooked. There were no sails on the windmill. We then entered the arched gatehouse entrance, which still displayed elaborate carvings from the monastic era of griffins and swags, and passed through a now doorless opening into what was an empty shell, bereft of the machinery one would associate with a mill. I stood shocked. "But there must have been machinery, cogs and beams to operate it, even a millstone, but there is nothing, absolutely nothing." Just then an elderly gentleman strolled into the shell of the mill and said, "I do apologize for interrupting you, but the mill went out of business over 70-odd years ago, I believe in 1863. My grandfather was the last to work here, but it became unprofitable, and the building was stripped bare and sold off, and his lean-to cottage was knocked down. Still confused, I asked, "Thank you, but what was his name, out of interest?" He replied, "Why, it was Thomas Minns." The end.